The red dust of New Gettysburg swirled in the artificial wind generated by the colony's atmospheric processors. The memorial stood like a dark sentinel against the crimson sky, its black stone walls etched with thousands of names from the War of Terran Independence. Each name represented a human soul lost in the bloody conflict against the hegemony coalition. When humanity had fought tooth and nail for the right to exist as free beings among the stars, Marcus Chen had been standing guard at the eternal flame for 6 hours straight, his powered exoskeleton locked in perfect attention. The ceremonial armor bore the insignia of the Terran Memorial Guard, an elite unit whose members were selected not for their combat prowess, but for their unwavering dedication to honor. Marcus had served 3 tours in the Outer Rim conflicts before requesting transfer to this sacred duty. His weathered face showed no emotion, his cybernetic eye scanning the approaches to the memorial with mechanical precision. The memorial itself was a marvel of human engineering and artistry. Rising 300 meters into the rust-colored sky, the obsidian tower contained the genetic records of every human who had died in service to their species. At its base, the eternal flame burned with captured stellar plasma, a piece of Earth's sun that would burn for 10,000 years. Surrounding the tower, holographic displays showed the final moments of famous battles, the faces of heroes, and the words of those who had given everything for human freedom. Today marked the anniversary of the Battle of Proxima Station, where Admiral Sarah Rodriguez had sacrificed her entire fleet to prevent the coalition from reaching Earth. The memorial was busier than usual, with colonists from across New Gettysburg coming to pay their respects. Families left flowers at the base of the tower. Children placed handwritten letters to grandparents they had never met, and veterans stood in silent salute to fallen comrades. Marcus noticed the approaching hoverbike long before it reached the memorial grounds. The rider wore the colors of the Void Runners, a gang that had grown bold since the colonial government had focused its attention on the mining disputes in the southern continent. The bike's engine had been modified to produce an unnecessarily loud roar, and its rider seemed intent on disturbing the peaceful atmosphere of the sacred space. The bike circled the memorial once, twice, 3 times, its engine echoing off the stone walls like thunder. Visitors began to look up from their quiet contemplation, their faces showing confusion and growing anger. Marcus remained motionless, but his internal sensors tracked every movement of the vehicle, analyzing threat levels and calculating response protocols. The rider finally stopped directly in front of the eternal flame, removed his helmet to reveal a young man with the ritual scars of the Void Runners carved into his cheeks. His name was Jake Morrison, though Marcus's facial recognition software provided this information instantly. Morrison had a record of petty crimes and anti-government sentiment, but nothing that would have warranted Memorial Guard attention under normal circumstances. Morrison dismounted from his bike and approached the flame. The crowd grew silent, sensing that something was about to happen. Parents pulled their children closer, while veterans began to move forward, their faces grim with understanding. Morrison pulled a bottle of synthetic alcohol from his jacket and raised it in a mocking toast. "Here's to all the dead fools who died for nothing," Morrison called out, his voice carrying across the memorial grounds, fighting wars for rich politicians while their families starved on backwater colonies. What heroes! The crowd's reaction was immediate and visceral. Angry shouts erupted from the assembled visitors, and several people began moving toward Morrison with clear intent to stop him. But before anyone could reach the disrespectful youth, Marcus moved. The Memorial Guard's training was unlike anything in the regular military. They were taught to respond to threats against the memorial with measured escalation, but also with unwavering determination. Marcus's first step was to activate his external speakers, his voice cutting through the crowd noise with mechanical authority. "Sir, you are disturbing a sacred space dedicated to the honored dead. Please step away from the memorial and show proper respect." Morrison turned toward Marcus with a sneer. "Or what, tin soldier? You going to arrest me for free speech? This is a free colony, isn't it?" Marcus took 3 precise steps forward, his exoskeleton servos humming quietly. "This memorial is dedicated to those who died to ensure your freedom exists. I am requesting that you honor their sacrifice with appropriate behavior." The crowd had formed a rough circle around the confrontation, their anger palpable but held in check by Marcus's presence. Everyone on New Gettysburg knew about the Memorial Guard, though few had ever seen one in action. They were legendary for their composure and their absolute dedication to their duty. Morrison took a long drink from his bottle and then, with deliberate malice, poured the remaining contents onto the base of the eternal flame. The alcohol hissed and steamed against the superheated stone, creating a cloud of vapor that seemed to mock the sacred fire itself. "There," Morrison said with satisfaction. "What are you going to do about it?" Marcus's cybernetic eye flickered as he processed what had just occurred. In the Memorial Guard's Code of Conduct, desecration of the eternal flame was considered the highest form of blasphemy against the honored dead. The response protocols were clear, but they had never been implemented on a civilian before. The crowd waited in tense silence as Marcus stood motionless for what seemed like an eternity. His enhanced hearing picked up the whispered conversations of the visitors, their speculation about what would happen next. His tactical systems were analyzing Morrison's body language, threat assessment protocols running in the background of his consciousness. Finally, Marcus spoke, his voice carrying a weight that seemed to make the very air grow heavy. "Young man, you have chosen to dishonor the sacrifice of 847,000 human beings who died so that you could live free. The penalty for desecration of this memorial is clearly posted at every entrance. You have 30 seconds to apologize to the dead and depart, or I will be forced to implement corrective measures." Morrison laughed, but there was something hollow in the sound now. He had expected arrest, expected to be dragged away by colonial security. He had not expected this quiet, terrible certainty in the guard's voice. "Corrective measures?" Morrison mocked. "What are you going to do, lecture me to death?" Marcus began his countdown, each number falling like a hammer blow in the suddenly still air. 30, Marcus announced, his voice echoing through the memorial grounds with mechanical precision. Morrison shifted uncomfortably, glancing around at the crowd that had gathered. The faces surrounding him showed a mixture of anger, anticipation, and something that looked suspiciously like pity. He had expected them to be angry at the guard, not at him. The colonial citizens of New Gettysburg were supposed to be rebels, people who questioned authority. Why were they looking at him like he had just signed his own death warrant? 29. The countdown continued with relentless certainty. Marcus hadn't moved from his position, but something in the air had changed. The memorial's holographic displays seemed to flicker with increased intensity, and the eternal flame burned brighter, as if responding to the desecration that had been committed against it. Dr. Elena Vasquez stood at the edge of the crowd, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She had been visiting the memorial to honor her grandfather, who had died in the defense of Europa Station. As a xenobiologist who had spent years studying alien cultures, she understood better than most what the Memorial Guard represented. They weren't just soldiers. They were living embodiments of human values, trained to demonstrate what humanity stood for when faced with challenges to their core beliefs. 28. Morrison's bravado was beginning to crack. He had planned this stunt as a way to gain status within the Void Runners, to prove that he wasn't afraid of authority. But the absolute calm in the guard's voice suggested that whatever was about to happen would be far worse than a simple arrest. He looked toward his hoverbike, calculating whether he could reach it before the countdown finished. "You can't touch me," Morrison called out, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. "I know my rights. This is still a human colony, not some military dictatorship." Marcus continued his countdown without acknowledging the interruption. 27. In the crowd, former Colonial Marine Sergeant Tom Bradley stepped forward. His artificial leg, a souvenir from the Siege of Titan, clicked against the memorial's stone pathways as he moved. He had served alongside memorial guards during the war and knew exactly what Morrison had stumbled into. "Son," Bradley called out, his gruff voice carrying clearly across the space. "You need to apologize right now and get out of here. You have no idea what you've done." Morrison spun toward the veteran, his face flushed with anger and growing fear. "I don't need to apologize for anything. These dead heroes of yours died for nothing. The war accomplished nothing except making the rich richer and the poor poorer." 26. Dr. Vasquez moved closer to Bradley, recognizing the look of grim understanding on the veteran's face. "What exactly is going to happen?" she whispered. Bradley's expression was grave. "The Memorial Guard aren't just ceremonial. They're programmed with every combat technique known to humanity, enhanced with the finest military technology the species has ever produced. But more than that, They're connected to the memorial itself. When someone desecrates this place, they don't just offend the living, they offend the dead. 25. The holographic displays around the memorial had begun to shift, showing scenes from Morrison's own family history. His great-grandfather had died at the Battle of Wolf 359, fighting against coalition forces that would have enslaved the entire human race. His grandmother had served as a field medic during the Martian uprising, saving dozens of lives before taking shrapnel from a coalition bomb. Morrison himself had benefited from the freedoms these people had died to secure, had grown up in a society where he could speak his mind, choose his own path, and live without fear of alien oppression. 24. Morrison was beginning to understand that he had made a terrible mistake. The countdown wasn't just a threat. It was a countdown to judgment, and he was starting to realize that the judge standing before him represented something far more dangerous than colonial law enforcement. A small girl broke away from her parents and approached Morrison. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old, her school uniform marking her as a student from the local educational center. In her hands, she carried a small bouquet of flowers that she had intended to place at the memorial. "Mister," she said, her voice innocent and clear, "my daddy is up there." She pointed toward the wall of names. "He died fighting bad aliens so I could go to school." "Why are you being mean to him?" Morrison looked down at the child, and for a moment something resembling shame flickered across his features. But his pride and his commitment to his gang colors wouldn't let him back down now. Not in front of all these people. 23. Marcus's external sensors had been recording everything, analyzing not just Morrison's words and actions, but the responses of everyone present. The Memorial Guard's programming included sophisticated algorithms for determining appropriate responses to threats against the memorial. Morrison's continued defiance in the face of clear warnings had triggered protocols that went far beyond simple law enforcement. "Look, I don't know what kind of game you're playing," Morrison said, his voice cracking slightly, "but I'm not afraid of some programmed robot in fancy armor. You can't hurt civilians. It's against your programming." For the first time since the confrontation began, Marcus tilted his head slightly, a gesture that somehow managed to convey both curiosity and terrible certainty. "You are correct that I cannot harm civilians," Marcus replied, his synthesized voice carrying an odd inflection. "However, my programming does not classify individuals who desecrate the honored dead as civilians. According to the Memorial Protection Act of 2387, signed into law by the Colonial Congress and ratified by every human settlement in the galaxy, such individuals are classified as enemy combatants acting against the fundamental values of human civilization. 22. The crowd stirred uneasily. Few people knew about the Memorial Protection Act, but those who did understand its implications. It had been passed in the aftermath of several incidents where coalition sympathizers had attempted to destroy human memorials, and it gave memorial guards extraordinary authority to respond to threats against their sacred charges. Morrison's face had gone pale. "Enemy combatants? That's insane. I'm a human being. I'm on your side." 21. Marcus's cybernetic eye flickered as he accessed the legal databases stored in his memory cores. The Act specifically states that species membership does not determine loyalty. Actions determine loyalty. By desecrating this memorial, you have declared yourself an enemy of the values for which these people died. Therefore, you are an enemy of humanity itself. The countdown continued, each number bringing Morrison closer to a reckoning he was beginning to understand he could not escape. 20. As Marcus continued his relentless countdown, the memorial itself began to respond in ways that few of the assembled crowd had ever witnessed. The obsidian walls started to glow with a faint inner light, and the holographic displays shifted to show something that made several veterans in the crowd straighten to attention. The images now showed the final moments of the Battle of Terra's Gate, the last major engagement of the War of Terran Independence. Coalition forces had broken through the outer defenses and were preparing to deploy their planet-killer weapons against Earth itself. In desperation, Admiral Chen Wei-Ming had ordered the entire Terran First Fleet to ram the Coalition dreadnoughts, sacrificing 8,000 human lives to save 8 billion more. 19. Dr. Vasquez watched the displays with growing understanding. She had studied Coalition records captured after the war, and she knew what most humans didn't. The aliens had been genuinely puzzled by human behavior during the conflict. Coalition military doctrine was based on logical cost-benefit analysis. When faced with superior force, civilized species surrendered and accepted subjugation. It was the rational choice. Humans had done something that no other species in the galaxy had ever done. They had chosen death over slavery again and again, until their enemies began to believe that humans were simply insane. The Coalition had expected a brief campaign followed by efficient incorporation of human worlds into their empire. Instead, they had encountered a species that would literally burn their own planets rather than submit to conquest. 18. Morrison was now looking desperately around the crowd, searching for some sign of support or sympathy. Instead, he found faces that reflected a growing understanding of what he had done. These weren't just angry citizens. They were the descendants of people who had made impossible choices, who had faced extinction and responded with defiance that bordered on madness. The little girl with the flowers was still standing near Morrison, but now her mother had come to collect her. As the woman pulled her daughter away, she looked directly at Morrison with eyes that held no forgiveness. "My husband died defending the evacuation ships at Kepler Station," she said quietly. "He held the line for 6 hours against Coalition assault mechs so that 40,000 civilians could escape. He could have run. He chose to stay." 17. The woman's words seemed to trigger something in the crowd. Other voices began to speak, each one adding to a growing chorus of memory and loss. "My brother died when the Coalition hit the medical station at Proxima. He was trying to evacuate wounded children when the bombs fell. My squad leader threw himself on a Coalition fusion grenade to save the rest of us. He was 19 years old. My grandmother piloted her transport ship directly into a Coalition battlecruiser when her engines failed. She saved 300 refugees." 16. Morrison tried to interrupt to defend himself, but the voices continued without pause. Each story was a hammer blow, driving home the magnitude of what these people had sacrificed. They hadn't died for politicians or profit. They had died because they believed that human freedom was worth more than their own lives. Marcus stood motionless through the testimonials, but his sensors were recording everything. The Memorial Guard's purpose wasn't just to protect the physical structure of the memorial. They were designed to preserve the memory of what humans had accomplished, to ensure that the lessons of the war were never forgotten. 15. The countdown was more than half finished, and Morrison was beginning to panic. He looked toward his hoverbike, calculating distances and escape routes. But veteran Tom Bradley had moved to block his path, and other members of the crowd were positioning themselves around the memorial grounds. "You still don't understand, do you?" Bradley said, his artificial leg clicking as he shifted his weight. "This isn't about punishment. This is about education." Morrison spun toward him. "Education? What are you talking about?" 14. Bradley gestured toward the Memorial Guard. "Marcus there isn't just a soldier. He's a repository of human memory. Every guard carries the complete records of every person whose name is on these walls. They know how each one lived, how each one died, and why their sacrifice mattered. When someone desecrates this place, the guards don't just enforce laws, they enforce truth." The holographic displays had begun to show more recent events. Images of Coalition prison camps, where captured humans had been subjected to experiments designed to understand their unusual psychology. Footage of human resistance fighters who had continued to operate even after their worlds had been conquered. Records of Coalition scientists studying human remains, trying to find some genetic or biological explanation for their refusal to submit. 13. Dr. Vasquez stepped forward, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent years studying alien cultures. "The Coalition called us the incomprehensible species in their official reports. They couldn't understand why we fought when victory was impossible. They analyzed our biology, our psychology, our social structures, looking for some explanation for our behavior." She gestured toward the memorial walls, where the names of the dead seemed to glow more brightly with each passing second. They never found an answer because they were looking in the wrong place. They thought it was about genetics or brain chemistry. But it was simpler than that. We fought because we chose to fight. We died because we chose to die rather than live as slaves. That choice, that fundamental human choice, is what this memorial represents. 12. Morrison was now backing away from Marcus, but he found himself hemmed in by the crowd. Every face around him reflected the same grim understanding. They weren't angry at him anymore. They were disappointed, as if he had revealed himself to be something less than human. "I didn't know," Morrison stammered. "I didn't understand what this place meant." 11. Marcus finally moved, taking a single step forward. The sound of his armored boot against the stone was like thunder in the sudden silence. When he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that seemed to resonate through the very bones of everyone present. "Understanding is earned through respect, not granted through ignorance. You chose to dishonor the dead without seeking to understand their sacrifice. That choice has consequences." 10. The eternal flame suddenly flared brighter, and the memorial systems activated functions that most visitors had never seen. From hidden speakers throughout the grounds came the sound of a single human voice, clear and strong despite the static of an old recording. It was Admiral Sarah Rodriguez, speaking her final words as her flagship prepared to ram the Coalition command vessel at Proxima Station. "Tell them we chose this. Tell them we died free." The recording ended and the countdown continued with terrible inevitability. 9. As the countdown entered its final phase, something unprecedented began to happen across New Gettysburg. The memorial's communication systems, designed to coordinate with other human memorials throughout the galaxy, had automatically transmitted a priority alert about the desecration event. Within minutes, every memorial guard in human space had received notification of what was occurring. On Europa Station, Guard Captain Sarah Kim paused in her watch over the memorial to the outer colony defenders. The alert that flashed across her visual display caused her to access archived records dating back to the war itself. She had never seen a civilian desecration event require active intervention before. In the Centauri system, Master Guard Rodriguez stood vigil over the memorial to the lost fleets. His ancient cybernetic systems, some of the first-generation Memorial Guard augmentations, processed the incoming data with cold efficiency. He began transmitting tactical analysis and historical precedent data back to New Gettysburg. On Mars, at the Grand Memorial that honored all human war dead, Senior Guard Thompson accessed the deepest archives of human military history. Her consciousness briefly merged with the memorial's central intelligence, drawing upon centuries of recorded human courage and sacrifice. 8. Morrison felt the change in the air before he understood what was happening. The memorial around him was no longer just a local monument. Through quantum communication networks that spanned the galaxy, it had become connected to every place where humans remembered their dead. The weight of that collective memory was pressing down on him like a physical force. Marcus's cybernetic eye flickered as he received tactical updates from his fellow guards. The information flowing through the Memorial Guard network included detailed psychological profiles of desecration events, historical analysis of similar incidents, and recommendations for appropriate response measures. But more importantly, the network was sharing something else: stories, millions of them. Every act of courage, every sacrifice, every moment when a human being had chosen to do what was right rather than what was easy. The Memorial Guards weren't just soldiers or historians. They were the living repository of human virtue, and that repository was now focused entirely on one foolish young man who had chosen to dishonor the dead. 7. Dr. Vasquez had moved closer to Marcus, her scientific curiosity overcoming her caution. She could see data flowing across the displays built into his armor, streams of information that seemed to pulse with their own inner life. As a xenobiologist, she had studied many alien species, but she had never seen anything like the Memorial Guard network in action. "He's not just connected to the memorial," she whispered to Tom Bradley. "He's connected to all of them. Every Memorial Guard in human space is sharing information about what's happening here." Bradley nodded grimly. "They're probably sharing more than information. The guards don't just remember the dead, they carry their spirits." As if in response to his words, the holographic displays around the memorial began to show faces. Not the faces of famous heroes or legendary battles, but ordinary people who had made extraordinary choices. A maintenance worker, who had stayed behind to keep life support running while evacuation ships escaped. A teacher who had hidden her students from coalition troops and died protecting them. A farmer who had destroyed his own crops rather than let them feed an occupying army. 6. Morrison was now pressed against the base of the memorial tower, his back to the obsidian wall. The names carved into the stone seemed to burn against his skin, and he could swear he heard whispers in languages he didn't recognize. But as he listened more carefully, he realized they weren't alien languages at all. They were human voices speaking in the dozens of dialects and languages that had emerged in the colonies, all of them saying the same thing: remember us. The little girl with the flowers had returned, despite her mother's attempts to pull her away. She stood directly in front of Morrison, her young face serious beyond her years. "My teacher says that people who died for freedom become part of the memorial," she said in her clear, innocent voice. "She says they're still watching to make sure nobody forgets what they did." "Are you trying to make them sad?" Morrison looked down at the child and felt something break inside him. These weren't abstract historical figures or propaganda tools. They were real people who had faced impossible choices and chosen to sacrifice everything for ideals they believed in. And he had mocked them, had dishonored their memory for no better reason than teenage rebellion and gang loyalty. 5. Marcus accessed his final protocol subroutines, the programs that would determine exactly how to respond to Morrison's continued defiance. The network of memorial guards had reached consensus. This was not simply a matter of colonial law enforcement. This was about preserving the fundamental values that defined human civilization. The response protocols were clear, but they offered Morrison one final opportunity. The Memorial Guard Code included provisions for redemption, based on the human belief that even the worst mistakes could be forgiven if the offender truly understood the magnitude of their actions. 4. The countdown was almost finished, but Morrison suddenly stepped forward, away from the wall of names. His face had changed, the arrogant sneer replaced by something that looked like genuine remorse. "Wait," he said, his voice cracking. "I want to understand. I want to know what I did wrong." Marcus paused, his sensors analyzing Morrison's biometric data for signs of deception: heart rate, pupil dilation, skin conductivity, vocal stress patterns. All indicated genuine emotional distress rather than calculated manipulation. 3. The crowd held its breath as Morrison continued. "I've lived my whole life thinking the war was just politics, just powerful people sending poor people to die for their benefit. But that's not what this is about, is it?" Dr. Vasquez stepped forward, her voice gentle but firm. "The war was about choice, Morrison. The coalition offered humanity a simple bargain: submit to their rule and live in comfort as a subject species, or resist and face extinction. Every human who died in that war chose extinction over submission." 2. Morrison looked around at the faces surrounding him, finally seeing them clearly for the first time. These weren't just angry colonists. They were the children and grandchildren of people who had faced the ultimate test of their values and had not been found wanting. "But why?" Morrison asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Why choose death over slavery? Why not just accept the coalition's offer and live?" Tom Bradley answered, his gruff voice carrying the weight of personal experience. "Because some things are more important than living, son. Some things are worth dying for. Freedom is one of them. Honor is another. The right to choose your own path, to make your own mistakes, to be human in your own way. That's worth any sacrifice." 1. Marcus raised his armored hand, and for a moment it seemed as though he might strike Morrison down where he stood. But instead he pointed toward the wall of names behind the young man. "Choose," Marcus said, his synthesized voice carrying infinite patience and terrible certainty. "Honor their sacrifice or face the consequences of dishonoring it. This is your final moment to decide what kind of human you want to be." The countdown had reached 0, but Morrison's response would determine whether it was an ending or a beginning. The silence that followed the end of Marcus's countdown seemed to stretch into eternity. Morrison stood frozen, his face a mask of conflicting emotions as he stared at the armored figure before him. The weight of 800,000 names pressed down on him from the memorial wall, each one representing a choice to value something more than personal survival. Slowly, Morrison sank to his knees before the eternal flame. His gang colors, once worn with defiant pride, now seemed like childish costume jewelry in the presence of such profound sacrifice. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible above the whisper of the artificial wind. "I choose to honor them," he whispered. "I don't understand it all yet, but I want to learn. I want to understand what they died for." Marcus lowered his pointing hand and stepped back, his sensors reading the genuine contrition in Morrison's voice and posture. The Memorial Guard protocols included provisions for this outcome, though it was rare enough that most guards never witnessed it in their entire service. Understanding begins with respect, Marcus replied, his synthesized voice somehow conveying approval despite its mechanical nature. And respect begins with acknowledgement of truth. The holographic displays around the memorial shifted once again, but this time they showed something different. Instead of battles and heroic sacrifices, they displayed the aftermath of the war. Human colonies rebuilding themselves according to their own values, children growing up free to choose their own paths, artists and scientists and philosophers exploring the full potential of human creativity without fear of alien censorship. Dr. Vasquez approached Morrison slowly, her movements careful and non-threatening. As a xenobiologist, she had spent years studying the psychological effects of the war on both humans and aliens. She understood better than most what Morrison was experiencing. The Coalition kept detailed records of their interactions with human prisoners, she said softly. They were genuinely puzzled by our behavior. In their experience, defeated species became model citizens once they accepted the logic of submission. They offered security, comfort, and protection from the chaos of self-governance. Morrison looked up at her, tears leaving tracks through the dust on his cheeks. Then why didn't we accept? Why choose war? Tom Bradley moved closer, his artificial leg clicking against the stone. Because we're not just any species, son. We're humans. And humans have this terrible, wonderful habit of believing that some things matter more than being safe. The little girl with the flowers had been watching the entire exchange with the intense focus that only children could maintain. Now she approached Morrison and held out her bouquet, the simple gesture carrying more weight than any sermon or lecture. These are for my daddy, she said simply, but I think he would want to share them with you since you're sorry now. Morrison accepted the flowers with shaking hands, the simple kindness of the gesture breaking something loose inside him. He had come to the memorial planning to demonstrate his rejection of everything it represented. Instead, he found himself holding flowers meant for a hero he had never met, feeling the weight of responsibility for carrying on the values that Hero had died to preserve. Marcus had been monitoring the entire exchange through his enhanced sensors, but he was also receiving data from the Memorial Guard network. The response to Morrison's change of heart was immediate and profound. Guards across human space were updating their protocols, recording this incident as an example of successful intervention rather than punitive action. But more than that, the memorial itself was responding. The eternal flame burned brighter, and the names on the walls seemed to pulse with gentle light. The quantum-entangled stellar plasma that fueled the flame was somehow attuned to human emotion, designed by its creators to reflect the living memory of the dead. There is something you must understand, Marcus said, his voice taking on a formal tone that indicated he was about to impart crucial information. The Memorial Guard does not exist to punish those who dishonor the dead. We exist to ensure that their sacrifice is never forgotten, and that the values they died for continue to live in those who come after. Morrison struggled to his feet, still clutching the flowers. What do I need to do? How do I make this right? Marcus gestured toward the wall of names behind them. Learning is the beginning of honor. You will study the records of those whose names are inscribed here. You will understand not just how they died, but how they lived and what they believed was worth dying for. And when you understand, you will teach others. The crowd that had gathered to witness Morrison's punishment found themselves watching something entirely different. A redemption. The anger that had filled the air when Morrison first desecrated the flame had been replaced by something more complex. Hope, perhaps. Or recognition that humans were capable of growth even in their darkest moments. Dr. Vasquez accessed her personal data pad and pulled up a research file. I've been studying Coalition records for years, trying to understand their perspective on the war. One document in particular has always stayed with me. It was a psychological analysis written by their chief xenobiologist after the Battle of Vega Sector. She began to read from the ancient text, her voice carrying the weight of alien incomprehension. Human behavior continues to defy rational analysis. When faced with certain defeat, they fight harder. When offered terms of surrender that would preserve their lives and comfort, they choose death. When their leaders fall, new leaders emerge from the ranks. When their worlds burn, they rebuild them stronger. We have concluded that humans suffer from a species-wide psychological disorder that prevents them from accepting logical outcomes. Morrison listened to the alien words with growing wonder. They thought we were insane. They thought we were broken, Tom Bradley answered with grim satisfaction. They couldn't understand that we weren't fighting for logical reasons. We were fighting for human reasons, love, honor, the right to determine our own fate, the belief that freedom is worth any price. Marcus accessed his historical databases and projected a new image into the air above them. It showed the signing of the Terran Independence Accords, the document that had officially ended the war and established humanity's right to exist as a free species. The coalition representatives in the image looked confused and defeated, unable to comprehend how a supposedly inferior species had outlasted their superior technology and numbers. The coalition agreed to the accords not because they were defeated militarily, Marcus explained, but because they came to understand that humans would never stop fighting. We had demonstrated that we would choose extinction before submission, and that choice made us impossible to conquer. Morrison stared at the image, beginning to grasp the magnitude of what his people had accomplished. So the war wasn't really about winning battles. It was about proving that we couldn't be broken. Every name on these walls, Marcus said, gesturing toward the memorial, represents proof of human character. They died to demonstrate that there are some things more important than living. In doing so, they didn't just save our species. They defined what our species stands for. The little girl tugged on Morrison's jacket, drawing his attention back to her innocent face. "Are you going to help take care of the memorial now?" she asked with the directness that only children possessed. Morrison looked down at her, then at the flowers in his hands, then at the wall of names that stretched up into the red sky. For the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to be part of something larger than himself. "Yes," he said, his voice firm with newfound purpose. "I think I am." The transformation in Morrison's demeanor was immediately visible to everyone present. The sullen rebellion that had defined him moments before had been replaced by something entirely different, a sense of purpose born from genuine understanding. He approached the base of the eternal flame with careful, reverent steps, and placed the little girl's flowers at the foot of the memorial with the solemnity of a sacred ritual. Marcus watched the scene unfold through his enhanced sensors, recording every detail for the Memorial Guard archives. This incident would become part of the training protocols for future guards, an example of how education could triumph over punishment when dealing with those who had dishonored the dead through ignorance rather than malice. The crowd began to disperse slowly, but many lingered to observe what would happen next. Word of the confrontation had spread through New Gettysburg's communication networks, and people were arriving from across the colony to witness the aftermath. The story was already being transmitted to other worlds through the interstellar news networks, carrying with it the fundamental message that human values could not be destroyed by disrespect or ignorance. Dr. Vasquez approached Marcus with the measured steps of someone seeking official permission. "Guard Chen, I would like to request access to the memorial's historical archives for Mr. Morrison. If he's serious about learning, he'll need comprehensive information about what these people died for." Marcus tilted his armored head in acknowledgement. "Permission granted, Dr. Vasquez. The archives are open to all who seek understanding with genuine intent." He paused, accessing protocols that hadn't been used in decades. "Additionally, I am authorized to offer Mr. Morrison a provisional educational placement within the Memorial Guard Support Program." Morrison's head snapped up at those words. "What does that mean?" "It means," Tom Bradley interjected with something that might have been approval, "that you'll be working here, maintaining the memorial grounds, assisting visitors, learning the stories behind every name on these walls. It's not easy work and it's not glamorous, but it's honest." The little girl clapped her hands together with delight. "That means you'll be here when I come to visit Daddy. You can help me bring him flowers." Morrison knelt down to her level, his entire demeanor transformed by the weight of his new understanding. "What's your daddy's name?" "I want to learn about him." "Lieutenant David Chen," she said proudly. "Mama says he was very brave. He flew his fighter into the big enemy ship so the good guys could escape." Morrison's face went pale as he processed the significance of that name. He looked up at Marcus with sudden realization. "Chen, you're related to him." Marcus's external speakers carried a note of pride that seemed almost human. "Lieutenant David Chen was my grandfather. He died at the Battle of Rigel Crossing. destroying a coalition command vessel at the cost of his own life and the lives of his entire squadron. 17 escape ships carrying civilian refugees were able to reach safety because of his sacrifice. The little girl beamed at this information. That means you're sort of like my family too. The simple innocence of her words struck Morrison like a physical blow. He was beginning to understand that the memorial wasn't just about grand historical events or famous battles. It was about families torn apart by war, about children who grew up without parents, about the ongoing cost of human freedom. Dr. Vasquez had been watching the exchange with professional interest, but now she stepped forward with a proposal. Marcus, I've been thinking about something. Mr. Morrison's transformation here today might serve as an example for others who don't understand what the memorial represents. Would the Memorial Guard be willing to participate in an educational program for colonial youth? Marcus accessed his command protocols and found precedents for such programs. The Memorial Guard Code includes provisions for educational outreach, provided it serves the primary mission of preserving the memory of the honored dead. Such a program would be acceptable. Morrison stood up, his mind racing with possibilities. I could help with that. I know kids like I was. Kids who think the war was just about politics and power. Maybe if they understood what really happened. Tom Bradley nodded approvingly. That's the spirit, son. Nothing honors the dead better than making sure the living understand what they died for. The veteran's words seemed to trigger something in the memorial's systems. The holographic displays shifted to show a new set of images. Not battles or heroes, but classrooms full of children learning about human history. Teachers explaining the principles of freedom and self-determination. Students visiting memorials across human space, their faces reflecting the same wonder and understanding that Morrison had just experienced. Marcus accessed additional archived footage and projected it into the air above them. The images showed coalition prison camps where human captives had been held during the war. Unlike the prisoners of other species who had quickly adapted to their new circumstances, the humans had continued to resist. They had organized escape attempts, sabotaged coalition equipment, and maintained military discipline even in captivity. The coalition documented these incidents extensively, Marcus explained. They were particularly puzzled by the behavior of human prisoner 7834, a maintenance technician named Sarah Morrison. Morrison's eyes widened in shock. Morrison? Was she? Marcus consulted his genealogical databases. Your great-aunt. She was captured during the fall of Kepler Station and held in coalition custody for 2 years. According to their records, she attempted to escape 47 times, despite knowing that each attempt resulted in punishment for herself and her fellow prisoners. The holographic display showed a grainy image of a woman who shared Morrison's basic facial features. Her head held high despite the obvious hardships of imprisonment. She was standing in front of a coalition interrogation panel, her expression defiant even in chains. She never gave them any useful intelligence, Marcus continued. When they offered her better treatment in exchange for cooperation, she refused. When they threatened her with execution, she told them that humans had been dying for freedom long before the coalition existed, and would continue to do so long after the coalition fell. Morrison stared at the image of his great-aunt, feeling the weight of family legacy settle around his shoulders. She died in the camp? No, Marcus replied. She was among the prisoners liberated when the Terran Marines retook Kepler Station. She lived for 30 more years on New Glasgow, where she worked as a teacher and raised 4 children. But she never forgot her time in captivity, and she never forgot why she had refused to cooperate with her captors. Dr. Vasquez pulled up additional information on her data pad. I interviewed her in 2387 as part of my research into human psychological resilience. She told me something I've never forgotten. The coalition could imprison my body, but they could never imprison the idea of freedom. As long as that idea lived in human hearts, we could never truly be defeated. Morrison felt tears streaming down his face as he listened to his great-aunt's words. She understood what I didn't, what I'd been too stupid to see. The little girl tugged on Morrison's sleeve again, her young face serious. Don't be sad. Daddy always said that making mistakes is how we learn to be better people. You're going to be better now, right? Morrison wiped his eyes and smiled at her with genuine warmth. I'm going to try my best. Your daddy sounds like he was a very wise man. Marcus stepped forward and extended his armored hand toward Morrison. The Memorial Guard welcomes you to your new duties. Mr. Morrison. Your shift begins at dawn tomorrow. Dr. Vasquez will provide you with access to the historical archives, and Veteran Bradley will supervise your practical training. Morrison took the guard's hand, feeling the power in the mechanical grip. I won't let you down. I won't let them down. He gestured toward the wall of names behind them. See that you don't, Marcus replied. The dead deserve nothing less than our best effort to ensure their sacrifice was not in vain. As the red sun of New Gettysburg began to set, casting long shadows across the memorial grounds, Morrison found himself standing guard beside Marcus, learning the proper stance and bearing of someone entrusted with protecting the memory of heroes. The transformation was remarkable to witness. A young man who had arrived as an enemy of human values was now beginning his journey toward becoming their guardian. 6 months later, the memorial to the Terran war dead had become something more than a monument to the past. It had evolved into a living center of education and renewal, where young people from across New Gettysburg came to learn about the price of freedom and the responsibility that came with it. Morrison stood at his post beside Marcus, his own ceremonial uniform bearing the insignia of a Memorial Guard trainee. The transformation in his bearing was complete. Gone was the slouching rebel, replaced by a young man who understood the weight of the duty he had accepted. His knowledge of the memorial's history now rivaled that of graduate students, and his passion for sharing that knowledge had infected an entire generation of colonial youth. The educational program that Dr. Vasquez had proposed had exceeded all expectations. Students came not just from New Gettysburg, but from colonies throughout the sector. They arrived as Morrison had, ignorant of their heritage and skeptical of the values their ancestors had died for. They left as something else entirely. Young, humans who understood what it meant to be part of a species that chose principle over survival. Today was special. A delegation from the coalition remnant was visiting the memorial, part of the ongoing diplomatic efforts to build peaceful relations between humanity and their former enemies. The irony was not lost on anyone present. The descendants of those who had tried to enslave humanity were now coming to pay their respects to those who had died resisting that enslavement. The delegation leader was Admiral Kethvar, an elderly hegemony officer whose own grandfather had commanded coalition forces during the war. He approached the memorial with the careful, measured steps of someone who understood they were walking on sacred ground. Marcus observed the alien visitors through his enhanced sensors, analyzing their body language and emotional states. Unlike their wartime predecessors, these coalition representatives showed genuine respect for human sacrifice, even if they still struggled to understand the motivations behind it. Morrison had requested permission to address the delegation, and Marcus had granted it after consultation with the Memorial Guard network. The young man's transformation had been thoroughly documented, and his story had become part of the educational materials used throughout human space. Admiral Kethvar, Morrison began, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who had found his purpose in life. 6 months ago, I stood where you're standing now, and I didn't understand what this place meant. I thought the war was about politics and power, just like your people did. I was wrong. The alien admiral tilted his head in a gesture that indicated polite attention. What changed your perspective, young human? Morrison gestured toward the wall of names behind him. I learned that the war wasn't about territory or resources or political dominance. It was about something your people couldn't understand then, and something I hope you can understand now. It was about the right to choose. Dr. Vasquez stepped forward to provide additional context. Admiral, our research has shown that the fundamental difference between human and coalition thinking during the war was philosophical. Your people saw survival as the highest good, and therefore submission to superior force as logical. Humans saw freedom as the highest good, and therefore resistance to domination as necessary, regardless of the cost. Admiral Kethvar studied the memorial with the intense focus of someone trying to solve a complex puzzle. But surely survival must take precedence over abstract ideals. A dead species cannot enjoy freedom. Morrison smiled with the patience of someone who had wrestled with these same questions for months. That's where you're wrong, Admiral. A species that accepts slavery isn't really alive anymore. They're just existing. We proved that humans would rather die as ourselves than live as something else. The little girl who had given Morrison flowers on that first day had become a regular visitor to the memorial. Now 8 years old and even more precocious, she approached the alien delegation with the fearlessness that only children possessed. "My daddy died so I could choose what I want to be when I grow up," she announced to Admiral Kethvar with startling directness. "What did your people die for?" The question struck the alien delegation like a physical blow. Admiral Kethvar knelt, down to the child's level, his alien features showing something that might have been sadness. "My people died because they were ordered to die," he admitted quietly. "We fought because we were told to fight. We never questioned whether our cause was worth dying for." Marcus stepped forward, his armored presence adding weight to the conversation. "That difference, Admiral, is what made humans impossible to defeat. Every human soldier understood why they were fighting. Every civilian who died in the bombardments knew what they were dying for. You were fighting an entire species that had chosen its values and was willing to die for them." The alien admiral stood slowly, his gaze moving across the memorial walls where thousands of names reflected the afternoon light. "We called you the incomprehensible species. We spent years trying to understand your psychology, your motivations, your strategic thinking. We analyzed your biology, your social structures, your religious beliefs. We never found an answer." Tom Bradley, now a regular fixture at the memorial as Morrison's mentor, chuckled with dark humor. "The answer was simpler than you thought, Admiral. We're just stubborn. Humans don't like being told what to do, especially by people we haven't chosen to follow." Morrison had been studying coalition military records as part of his education, and he stepped forward with information that even surprised the alien delegation. "Admiral, did you know that coalition forces suffered a psychological breakdown rate 30 times higher than normal when fighting human forces? Your soldiers couldn't understand why we kept fighting when victory was mathematically impossible." Admiral Kethvar's expression showed genuine surprise. "I was not aware of that statistic." Dr. Vasquez accessed her research files and projected holographic data into the air between them. The Coalition Military Psychological Services documented thousands of cases of what they called human interaction syndrome, essentially existential crisis caused by encountering an enemy that didn't follow logical behavioral patterns. The data showed coalition soldiers breaking down after witnessing human acts of heroism that defied rational explanation. Pilots who had watched human fighters ram coalition battleships rather than eject. Infantry who had seen human medics charge into enemy fire to save wounded civilians. Commanders who had offered generous surrender terms only to be met with defiant refusal and continued resistance. "Your people couldn't comprehend martyrdom for ideals," Marcus explained. "The concept was literally alien to coalition thinking. When faced with a species that embraced such martyrdom as a core value, many of your soldiers questioned everything they had been taught about the nature of intelligent life." Morrison pulled up one of his favorite historical records, a piece of evidence that had fundamentally changed his understanding of the war. "Admiral, I want to show you something. This is a communication intercept from the Battle of Sigma Draconis, when Captain Elena Rodriguez chose to ram her damaged cruiser into a coalition dreadnought rather than surrender. The holographic display showed the final moments of the human warship, its hull breached and life support failing. Captain Rodriguez's final transmission was crystal clear. "Tell my children that freedom is worth more than life, and that choosing to die free is the most human thing a person can do." Admiral Kethvar listened to the recording with visible emotion. "She had children?" "3 of them," Morrison replied. "They're all adults now, living on colonies that exist because their mother chose to die rather than let that dreadnought reach its target. Her sacrifice saved 40,000 human civilians." The alien admiral was quiet for a long moment, processing what he had learned. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that hadn't been there before. "I begin to understand why the coalition could not defeat humanity," he said slowly. "We were not fighting an army or a government. We were fighting an idea that lived in the heart of every human being, and ideas, it seems, are far more dangerous than battleships." Morrison nodded with satisfaction. "Now you're starting to get it, Admiral. Every name on these walls represents someone who chose to die for that idea. And every child born since the war represents someone who lives because of that choice. As the alien delegation prepared to leave, Admiral Kethvar approached Morrison one final time. "Young human, I have one last question. Knowing what you know now about the cost of your freedom, do you believe it was worth the price?" Morrison looked around at the memorial, at the faces of the visitors who came daily to learn and remember, at the children who played in the shadow of the walls bearing their ancestors' names, at Marcus standing eternal guard over the honored dead. "Admiral," he said with absolute certainty, "I believe it was the most important thing our species has ever done. We proved that there are some things more valuable than survival. We proved that freedom is not just a political concept, but a fundamental expression of what it means to be human. And we proved that any species willing to die for its values is impossible to truly defeat." The alien delegation departed in thoughtful silence, carrying with them a new understanding of humanity that would reshape diplomatic relations for generations to come. But the memorial continued its eternal vigil, Marcus and Morrison standing guard over the names of heroes, ensuring that the lesson of human courage would never be forgotten. In the end, the biker who had disrespected the memorial had become its most passionate defender, proof that the values the dead had died for lived on in the hearts of those who chose to remember them. And in a galaxy where countless species had accepted subjugation rather than risk extinction, humanity stood as eternal proof that some things were indeed worth dying for.